The Dirtiest Tricks pulled in more common military maxim states that the best fight is an unfair one. Battlefield warriors will do anything to gain an advantage over their opponents, sometimes resorting to dirty tricks to stack the odds. 1967 to 1969 Project Eldest Son. Project Oldest Son. Punji pits, tripwires, and other booby traps were used extensively by the Viet Cong and MVA against the more powerful American and Allied forces, making the Vietnam War famous for its dirty fighting. However, the Americans were also willing to use underhanded tactics to win. For years, the Maccabee SOG had operated in Vietnam, sabotaging enemy ammunition and supply caches. However, any explosive used to detonate ammo dumps would scatter the rounds rather than destroy them, and SOG teams were too small to carry them away. Colonel John Singlab, a former OS operative, proposed sabotaging the ammunition in 1967, inspired by the British's Project Eldest Son, which involved planting sabotage rounds into VC and NVA storage depots. The majority of the rounds were 7.62 millimeters for the Guerrilla's ubiquitous AK-47, but their powder charge was replaced by a much more potent explosive that increased the chamber pressure from 45,000 psi to well over 250,000, causing catastrophic failure. The 12.7 millimeter rounds for heavy machine guns and mortar rounds were also replaced. Meanwhile, rumors spread of defects in Chinese-made weapons and ammunition. Documents that resembled official reports mentioned weapon failures due to poor manufacturing processes, and the Armed Forces Radio, which was monitored by North Vietnamese forces, issued bulletins urging Americans not to use captured weapons because their poor quality could lead to catastrophic failures, adding to the confusion. The fake reports and radio broadcasts emphasized the poor metallurgy of communist weapons to undermine the Vietnamese, Chinese, and other Eastern Bloc allies' relationship. In 1969, the press leaked the story, undermining the project's effectiveness. It was renamed Project Italian Green and then Project Bimbo before being abandoned. The number of rounds that fell to the VC and NVA and the damage they caused are unknown, but Vietnamese troops' faith and connection with their Chinese suppliers were shaken. After decades, pro-Assad forces in Syria may have used the same method against rebels, putting faulty rounds in illegal arms marketplaces. This may have been inspired by U.S. forces repeating Project Eldest Son in Afghanistan against the Taliban and their sympathizers. The British invasion of Tibet in 1903. The British invasion of Tibet. By the turn of the 20th century, Britain and Russia were playing the great game for Central Asian supremacy. Britain held India and wanted to expand its influence. The Viceroy of India, George Nathaniel Curzon, wanted to strengthen ties with Tibet, a Chinese protectorate, to protect Britain from foreign invasion. Instead of finding welcome in the poor nation to the east, Curzon heard rumors of Tibet working with the Russian government, which confirmed his greatest fear, that India was vulnerable to a Russian invasion through Tibet. Military advisors said bringing a large army through the Himalayas was nearly impossible, but there was still fear that if the Dalai Lama, Tibet's leader, allied with Russia, Britain's foothold in India could be threatened. General Francis Younghusband led a 3,000-man military force in 1903, including British soldiers, Indian troops, and a large contingent of Gurkhas and Sikhs. The British force had 2 Maxim machine guns and 4 artillery pieces, all of which were state-of-the-art for the time. All they needed was an excuse to invade, and rumors of Tibetan invasions provided that excuse. On March 31, 1904, the Tibetans blocked the mountain pass near Guru, preventing the British force from passing. Younghusband and Curzon invaded Tibet with this flimsy excuse. Some accounts say the British leadership convinced the Tibetans to douse the lit match cords, which were vital for the operation of the pieces, and unload their rifles and machine guns as a sign of goodwill during negotiations. The 3,000-strong Tibetan force was armed with swords, clubs, matchlock muskets, weapons more at home on 17th-century battlefields. Younghusband ordered his men to open fire, and they did so quickly because they had modern bolt-action rifles, while the Tibetan matchlocks were rendered inoperable. The resulting engagement was little more than a massacre, which would later be known as the Massacre of Tumakshenko. Around 700 Tibetans were killed, while the British force suffered heavy casualties. Much of the rest, Younghusband and his men easily defeated the outclassed Tibetans, forcing them to sign a humiliating peace, paying an indemnity and ceding some land to Britain within 6 months. The 1944 Grief Operation. In December 1944, Nazi Germany was crumbling, with Soviet armies pushing from the east and the Western Allies making significant progress after the Normandy landings. Adolf Hitler and the German High Command planned a counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest in Belgium to take Antwerp, a vital port and logistics center. Hitler ordered SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny to lead an operation behind the Western Allies' lines to increase Germany's chances. Scorzini had previously led a daring raid to rescue Italian dictator Benito Mussolini from captivity. Operation Grief was planned in October 1944. Scorzini and his soldiers wanted to seize at least one significant Meuse River bridge, but their main goal was to confuse American forces. Scorzini recruited 2,500 English-speaking German soldiers for the 150th Panzer Brigade in the weeks leading up to the Ardennes offensive, but only 400 could speak passable English and only a dozen could speak it fluently. They were sent to a 6-week training program where they learned as many Americanisms as possible by watching American newsreels and speaking with Americans. The goal was to blend in behind enemy lines and cause as much confusion as possible before the offensive, hoping to make the operation more successful. Scorzini lamented that they could certainly never do but American, not even a deaf one. Due to the lack of American uniforms, many adopted British or Russian clothing with bloodstains or POW marks. Despite these limitations, Operation Grief began. The wider Ardennes offensive caught the Allies off guard, and German forces penetrated deep into enemy lines, allowing some commandos to infiltrate American positions and commit sabotage, deliver false orders, and change road signs. In this chaotic environment, already bewildered American forces became paranoid that German infiltrators were everywhere. To combat this hidden threat, checkpoints were established, and those stopped were asked questions only Americans would know, such as state capitals, celebrities, and pop culture facts. Despite this confusion, Operation Grief and the Ardennes offensive failed. Most of the 150th Panzer Brigade's commandos were withdrawn and attached to a conventional unit. By January, the German forces were pushed back and the war was over. March Battle, 1984. On February 15, Iranian forces began a concentrated push against Iraqi forces in the Hawazin Marsh and Majnoon Island in southeastern Iraq, using speedboats to move quickly through the flooded terrain. Majnoon Island, UP. A journalist covering the conflict, Mark Feynman, spoke to an Iraqi officer about their plans to hold this important territory. The officer proudly showed him and the Iranians their extensive defense and depth system, which kept the Iranians in place. He gleefully told the journalist, "You wait until nighttime, you will see how we are killing these Iranian dogs. We are frying them like eggplants." That night, Feynman witnessed one of the Iranian assaults. The Iraqis fired artillery at the approaching boats, forcing the Iranians to jump from their boats into chest-deep water. Once they were wading through the marshland, an order was given and the generators were powered up, sending electricity through the water into the Iranian soldiers. Hundreds were electrocuted. After combat, Iran took the Hawazin marshes but failed to advance onto Basra. The operation was a Pyrrhic triumph for Iran, which incurred huge losses. Battle of Pelusium 525 BC. After a series of diplomatic ventures, the Persian Emperor Cambyses Ea invaded Egypt in 525 BC, where the two armies fought for supremacy. Persia was a rising power, expanding into territory and influence, while Egypt's glory days were behind them and could not withstand the invasion. Although historians doubt it, Cambyses allegedly used a peculiar sort of hostage-taking at the Battle of Pelusium to his advantage. Egypt considered things sacred. All life, and though they did eat meat, it made up a very small portion of their daily diet. They kept many animals as household pets, which were revered. Cats were seen as sacred because they were the manifestation of the goddess Bastet, who was symbolized as a woman with a cat's head. Cats, as sacred animals, were treated as part of the family and mummified. In the event of a house fire, all efforts were made to save the animals, even if it meant letting the flames spread. According to Herodotus, to deliberately kill a cat was a death sentence. When the Persian and Egyptian armies met at the Battle of Pelusium, Cambyses ordered his men to release large numbers of cats in front of their advancing army. According to Polyaenus, they also drove dogs, sheep, ibises, and other sacred Egyptian animals. The Egyptians were unwilling to risk offending the deity and were routed from the battlefield. The survivors, including Pharaoh Psamtik Ii, fled to Memphis, where they were besieged and defeated. Psamtik was captured and treated well by Cambyses, but he was executed for trying to rebel, giving the ever-expanding Persian Empire control of the rich and ancient land of Egypt. Conclusion: whether on ancient battlefields or in modern conflicts, troops would do whatever to win, even if it's dishonorable. Pragmatism usually wins out.